So moving ahead, some cultivars have very distinct color differences in the diebacks. The one on top, you can see that where there's that distinct difference in color. And when I kind of go out and about, I still see a fair bit of canes that are dyed back that are left at pruning. And so part of that might be, we're getting different people pruning at different times. But if you cut through those cross sections, you can see the live versus the dead. So that's cold temperature damage. It's easy to deal with though, just by avoiding it at pruning. So moving ahead, if you have lots of dieback, could be a shade issue, could be you have too heavy a crop load, could be a disease issue. So lots of potential reasons. So as we look at dormant bud damage, that's what a lot of people look at and worry about. And to be honest, there's always some damage. I mean, if you were to look at every vine and check, or a vine and check every single bud on there, even if it's the most cold hardy cultivar out there, there's always some damage. 100% of these buds are never alive. And there's lots of reasons for that. But basically, we want to make sure we don't have significant damage. And the photo on the left, you can see a little arrow pop up here as Aaron advances, has that dead primary bud, and the one on the right does not. And so a lot of people cut too deep. And so the key is when you're cutting these buds, you want to go about roughly a third of the way down, and you'll be able to see that. If you cut too deep, even if the primary bud is dead, it's going to look alive because you have to cut through that certain section. And so we try and do this before pruning. And I ran a few buds of Norton this year. I think we're at 20% damage when I checked in January, something along those lines, because we had that real cold snap in December. And so even if you have super cold hardy cultivars, it still makes sense to check a few, just because you never know. Just because something is rated, if we go to the next slide, to be cold hardy doesn't mean it will be. So here is where that primary bud, label number 1, is alive, and sometimes that secondary bud grows as well. And it's really not a huge deal when this happens because these crops are both going to ripen at the same time because these shoots are growing at the same time. So, some people will say go through and thin these out. That's a lot of labor. But basically, these crops off these two shoots will ripen at the same time. And it does happen that they grow at the same time, some cultivars especially. So if we move to the next slide, dormant bud damage can basically happen anytime. December, January, February, March, early April. And again, don't assume that because you have cold hardy cultivars that you don't have damage. It's less likely, but a lot of our cold hardy cultivars deacclimate very early in the spring, which puts them at risk. And so again, don't assume. And so again, just check your buds prior to pruning and go from there. So next slide. There's a lot of generalities with this type of situation. And to be honest, these are just generalities. Some of our cultivars are very fruitful on secondary buds. And so even if I have 50% damage, I may not have to adjust my bud number. But generalities are 0 to 20% is pretty typical in terms of how much damage we have. Probably don't do anything. 20 to 50, we may need to add some extra buds or leave some just in case. And above 50% usually indicates there may be some structural damage. Again, this is dormant buds here. And so a lot of people will do like a minimal type pruning, just get the bulk of the stuff off and then reassess it after bud break. But again, even that, depending on the cultivar, may be more than what you actually need to do. And so some people do like to leave extra buds just in case they have cold temperature later in the season. And that does make sense, but I would only do that if you're 100% committed to removing those extra buds later. If you're not 100% committed to that, probably that's a poor decision because you're going to have an insane amount of shoots popping out if you don't remove those. So it makes sense to do what some people call insurance pruning and leave some extra buds, but you just got to be careful that you do follow up. And if we do have primary bud damage and the secondary buds grow, they grow at about the same time as the live primary buds. So we don't really see a huge issue where the shoots coming from a primary versus secondary bud ripen at different times, because basically that secondary bud senses and quotes that that primary bud is dead and it starts growing right away in the spring or fairly early. And so, yeah, we'd like to have all our primary buds, but usually ripening happens pretty consistent or as consistent almost as if we had no damage. So what we're probably more likely to talk about now in the next slide is spring damage. And that would be as the vines are deacclimating, we lose buds that are swelling or young shoots. And a lot of these are kind of a wait and see approach. And if I had to choose between these two, I'd rather have total primary bud loss than a partial primary bud loss where 50% are alive and 50% are not. Again, this is when we're losing young shoots. The reason being is it's tough to know what to do when we have a partial loss. With a few exceptions, most of our cultivars ripen early enough that if we have a late spring frost and it kills all our primary buds, we still have time to ripen a crop a little bit later in the season. And so that the tough thing is when you have that partial primary bud loss is what do you do and what crop are you going to focus on? So if we go to the next slide, there's a lot of terms thrown out there and we don't all use them the same. And so if you look at the official terms, the term bud break is a pretty vague one, and I use that term from time to time. Just are the buds developing? But really, we go first swell, full swell, then bud burst. And bud burst is when you see that separation of that leaf from the tip of that bud. And these are not like hard fact numbers. From first swell to full swell, there's a huge difference in 10% bud kill. But where a lot of people were at in central Iowa, at least, they were basically at bud burst when they had these cold temperatures. Some growers from farther north and farther west than where I'm at, we're still in the swell stages, and from what they've told me, have not had a lot of issues. But when you start to see that bud burst and we get down to 29 or what have you, that's where you start to get worried. And so probably when we're having these discussions, we want to make sure we're all using the same terms. And so first swell, full swell, bud burst are the main stages that we're worried about this time of year. And I just was off on the phone this morning with the grower. He's at first leaf. And basically, once we hit bud burst, 28, 29 is going to potentially cause some damage. Again, these are not hard numbers. I'm going to show you some pictures here in a little bit where we got down to 29 and we were at first, second, third leaf, and we had 100% kill. And so while these numbers are out there, they are not exact. And so you got to take them with a bit of a grain of salt. So on the next slide, we can see where we had a year of partial primary bud loss. And some of these pictures are from about 10 years ago. And here's a scenario where we lost some buds farther out on the tips of these canes because generally, on average, they break bud earlier on the tips of those canes. And so they're out a little bit farther than the ones farther down on the canes, as you can see. So this is a partial primary bud loss, but it probably won't cause a huge issue with asynchronous ripening just because this is happening early enough that these dead shoots on the top, those secondary buds will pop out very quickly. And if you go to the next photo, you can see what happened that year. Yeah, there's a difference, maybe a week difference, give or take. But when we kind of think about spring weather, which is pretty cool, and if this is a cultivar we're ripening and we're picking in August or early September, a week in late April, early May is like a few days in early September or something like this. So this, while looks bad right now, it may not be as bad as what we think. That those berries, yeah, there'll be some issues with them ripening asynchronously on those shoots, but probably not as bad as what it could be. because that damage happened early enough that those secondary buds popping out aren't that far behind the primary buds. So again, it's a wait and see approach. Some years it's worse. So go to the next slide, please. And this was where we had a radiation freeze. And this is the same plant, the top of the plant, the bottom of the plant. And when we went down this vineyard, literally, as you change in elevation, we had 100% loss. And the top of the vineyard, we had no loss because it was a radiation freeze and that cold air just settled. And this is a little trickier because these shoots are out quite a bit farther. And so on the downhill part of that vineyard, basically you're starting from scratch, and the uphill part of the vineyard, you're sitting pretty good. And that's where we get concerned about now these are 2 or 3 weeks apart, and how's that going to affect ripening? And what do we do? So if we go to the next picture, I mean, usually we don't see this big of a disparity. You know, this photo is a little bit extreme, but this is the concern when we have a situation like the picture before, where the shoots were out 2, 3, 4 inches, well, probably 4 to 6 inches actually. Those some stayed alive, some died, and now that secondary crop is way behind the primary shoots, and that's where the tough decision making happens, because you got to choose, when do you pick? Do you pick based on the primary buds, the secondary buds, you average them out? And that's a tough decision. No one has the time and labor to strip off one shoot or the other. And it's a bit of a guessing game which you go by. And most people I've talked to in this situation, they kind of go with an average, to be honest with you. So here we see the primary shoots are hitting veraison. The ones that did get dinged by frost and came from a secondary bud are a ways behind. So if we go to the next slide, really that partial primary bud loss issue, if it happens when the shoots are 4 to 6, maybe even longer inches out, that's where we have that asynchronous ripening issue. If it happened right now, like some people lost some primary buds this past week, probably not going to have that big of an issue. And like I mentioned, if you go forward a second, the challenge is, when do you harvest? And I'd probably say whatever the bulk of the shoots are is what you go off of. You know, if you're machine harvesting, maybe some of that unripe fruit doesn't get picked, but probably will be. And those are the challenges. But sometimes it looks worse than it is, just because, again, the springtime, the weathers are cool, those shoots look way far apart, and with those differences may not be as bad as you get closer to ripening. So the last scenario is total primary bud loss, and that's basically where we lose everything. And this was, I believe, 2010, 2009, one of the two, where I had some plots at some different places back in the day. These were out, 6 to 12 inches. We got down to 29. Next slide. And we had a 100% bud loss. And this is the day after. And a couple days later, these are all brown, shriveled, drying off. And what surprised me was the year before, we had an average of like 4 different cultivars. We were pulling about 5.2 tons per acre. And in 2010, off of our secondaries, we still pulled 4 tons per acre in these plots, give or take. And people would ask why. Well, they got shoot positioned in June the year before, so had really good sunlight into that canopy. So secondary buds were in a really good situation to get sunlight, be very hardy, be very fruitful. And so, again, this looks horrible, and it did delay harvest by a couple weeks. But we actually got a good crop because we had cultivars that were quite fruitful on those secondary buds. And we did shoot positioning, combing in June the year before to kind of ensure that sunlight got in there to make them more fruitful. It's easy to say to do that when labor is limited. But in years like this, it probably pays off in terms of time. And again, 100% of these buds died. So everything had to come back from secondary buds. This fruit ripened basically at the same time. And so we didn't have these asynchronous ripening issues like when you have partial damage. Next slide. So again, probably not an issue with total primary shoot loss with asynchronous ripening. Things we have control of, if you click forward, we don't really, cultivars, we grow at cells, right? So yeah, fruitfulness of secondary buds is always in my mind when you're selecting a cultivar, but you grow at cells, you know. But that canopy management does have an impact on those secondary buds. And again, you have to decide for your own operation, is it worth the time to do that? Do you have the resources to make sure that sunlight's getting in there? But it does make a difference. And again, that May 10 frost, if you click forward, that set us back. But again, the growing degree days in early May, you weren't accumulating a lot. So yeah, we were set back a couple weeks spring wise, but not as much at harvest time just because most of these cultivars are getting picked in mid-September. And so we didn't see any negligible issues in terms of that. Now, if I was growing Norton in Iowa or something like that, this would probably be an issue because we're already pushing it in terms of getting that ripening before we get a fall frost. But for the vast majority of our cultivars, we're not, unless it's a very cool year, which does happen, we're not always pushing the boundaries of harvesting before that fall frost. So to kind of wrap things up, next slide, cold temperature can happen anytime. And with dieback in the fall, we just do selective pruning to solve that. If we look at dormant bud damage, we check it at pruning. If needed, adjust the numbers. If you're willing to, follow up with that. Spring damage, if we have partial damage, that's what I worry about the most because we have the asynchronous ripening. Total loss, we generally have later harvest, but the berries generally ripen at the same time. So if I had to choose the two, and it's not a late ripening cultivar, I'd almost prefer total loss. And in both situations, secondary buds are pretty important for us as our backup. So again, if you need a high yield and you need the crop, we do want to think about that canopy microclimate in June, early July. So that is my talk. So if you want to click ahead here a sec, Aaron. So a couple things most of you know or have my newsletter. We should have Iowa State Fruit website up here soon with some stuff that we add from time to time, some resources. So once that's available, I'll let people know. And there's my contact info if you have any questions.